Hi, I'm Vince Molinari, and welcome to FinTech TV's ETF Rundown, and we are broadcasting from the iconic New York Stock Exchange. I am delighted to have Dan Katz join us today. He is the co-founder of Amberwave Partners. Welcome to the show, Dan.
Great to be with you.
Well, delighted to have you. Start us off. Tell us a little bit about Amberwave Partners, what you're doing. It's so innovative. Love to hear all about it.
Sure. So first off, it's great to be here, and thanks for having us.
Well, we're delighted.
So Amberwave Partners is a new investment manager that I founded along with two other co-founders earlier this year. And in Amberwave, really what we're trying to do is to focus on mega trends that are impacting the global economy in ways that we see driving investment performance over time. And in particular, what we're focused on are the general themes of U.S. jobs, security, and growth, which we call JSG rather than ESG, which is another term you hear about a lot in the markets right now. And so what does JSG investing mean in practice? Really what it means for us is, we're looking to evaluate companies that are performing better on our metrics around U.S. jobs, security, and growth, which we expect to generate sustainable outperformance over time. So what does that mean in practice? There's no question that over the last 2 years, we've all been very accustomed to this idea around supply chains and your supply chain security impacting your investment performance. And that's a great example of how we look at things through the security lens. And so when we apply our JSG framework, one of the things we're looking for is just how resilient and just how sustainable company supply chains are. And that's how we try to identify outperformance associated with those JSG factors and deliver returns for investors over time.
I want to talk about your ETF launch, IUSA, but I want to go back for a second because I think it's important. When I looked into Amberwave Partners, the depth of experience of your partners, your co-founders, Department of Treasury alums and this brain center, and having this deep experience in really these macro problems, creating the solution, executing around those, and that's particularly so important as we found out through COVID. So that level of experience, when everybody talks about supply chains, how many people knew what supply chain was prior to COVID? So when you talk a little bit more about how do you analyze that within the JSG framework, and what does JSG really mean in the end?
Yeah, so it's a great question. But really what matters most, as you pointed out, is the substance of the work that we're actually doing to implement our job security and growth investing strategy. And when we look at some of our key JSG factors, really what it boils down to is, there is data that can inform our views, but judgment is just so important because you don't have things like standardized disclosure around supply chains. And there isn't just one metric you can focus on and say, aha, that's the number, and I can rigorously apply this mathematical formula there. So a lot of what this comes down to is actually really doing the work and analyzing each company individually to make a judgment about how it performs on these job security and growth factors vis-a-vis its peers. And that's what we do for a living. And so we think it's potentially a very, very powerful tool, and I'm sure we'll get into talking about the IUSA ETF, and that's a great example of how it can drive investment performance over time.
So much to talk about, but I want to go right into IUSA. Certainly from the ticker, that seems to say a lot right there. Well done. So tell us about it. When you take this, what sounds like level of quantitative analysis that you can certainly garner, but it's really that work, that heavy lift, that makes the difference, it seems, in IUSA.
Absolutely. And so with IUSA, the headline, what we're trying to deliver is outperformance that is specific to job security and growth performance. So what does that mean? So we start at the S&P 500 and we analyze each and every company in the S&P 500 on our job security and growth factors. We then take within each S&P 500 sector the top 20% of performers on JSG, and then they go into our ETF. So the ETF, IUSA, has 100 stocks in it. But critically, we have representation from every single industry, right? So every industry can be a job security and growth performer. So as a result, we've isolated for stocks that are relatively better performers on job security and growth rather than being driven by, for example, long technology and short energy like you've seen with some of the ESG plays in recent years. And the result of that is that since we've launched on January 19th, we've delivered about 200 basis points of outperformance to the S&P 500 with a beta to the S&P 500 of roughly 1. So
Wow.
all of the outperformance is associated with better performance on the job security and growth factors.
So really the differentiator, that ability to capture that alpha, comes from the JSG investing framework. And how do you maybe fine tune it or narrow it within the existing S&P 500 to get those outperformers?
Yeah, so it's really all about doing the work again. So let's take for example the materials sector, and one firm that features very highly in the materials sector that we identified prior to launching the ETF in January is Mosaic. Mosaic is a company that operates in the fertilizer industry, and what makes Mosaic unique vis-a-vis its peers is that it sources all of its fertilizer precursors in North America. This stands in contrast to some of its peers, which are heavily exposed to Russia and Ukraine, which are major exporters of both finished fertilizer products and fertilizer precursors. So we identified Mosaic as a better scorer for U.S. job security and growth prior to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, because we were looking at things like supply chain resiliency, vulnerability to geopolitical conflict. And as a result, we have Mosaic in our portfolio rather than some other materials companies. And Mosaic has delivered outperformance since we launched, in part because of its performance on JSG factors. So it's that kind of granular analysis that allows us to identify relative outperformers and capture that alpha within IUSA.
That's super helpful stuff. I really think about looking at those vulnerabilities, doing that work, and what is the risk management component of perhaps eliminating or adding to the portfolio, and capturing that alpha, or where is the delta between this work, if you would. Terrific. Before we close out, I'd love to get your take. We hear so much about ESG, and I think people are beginning to understand what ESG is. Where do you differentiate, or is there crossover when we think about JSG?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I think it's one that the market is really struggling with, because often it's hard to define exactly what ESG is. And I think part of the reason that is because there's been this general dichotomy that's been held up, where on one hand you have traditional investing, and on the other hand you have ESG, which purports to represent everything that people could possibly care about that impacts society. But in reality, ESG is actually a relatively narrow investment focus, which really deals heavily with climate change. That is an important issue, but it does not at all represent the sum total of issues that matter to the health of American communities. And so JSG is really meant to be a contribution to that overall ecosystem, so that investors who want to prioritize U.S. job security and growth can align their portfolios with those kind of values, rather than ESG, which purports to be very broad, but in reality is actually focused on very narrow issues. The other key differentiator, I'd say, is, as we discussed at length, there's a direct link, in our opinion, between JSG factors and investment outperformance. So really, we're trying to deliver both returns and a portfolio that can align with the things you want to prioritize.
Super helpful. Dan, you and the rest of the team, congratulations and best of luck with IUSA and whatever is coming next.
Great, thanks so much. It's been terrific.
It's a pleasure.